Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 22. Seljuk. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. Well, here we are. Finally. We've spent the last 6 episodes in what I called Informal Season 3, discussing the history of the Turks within the Abbasid Caliphate, the transformation of the Caliphate during the anarchy at Samarra, and the background to the rise of the Seljuks. And now we're here, ready to dive into the next great Turkish state. Really the first truly imperial Turkish state since the fall of the Göktürk Khanate, centuries earlier. So that makes this the beginning of Informal Season 4, which is of course going to cover the Great Seljuk Empire. Now I don't know how many episodes this is going to take, but I've decided that I'm going to cover the history of the Great Seljuks from their rise up through the reign of Melik Shah I. I'm then going to briefly cover the splintering of the empire, but instead of covering the rump of the Great Seljuk Empire and all of the successor states throughout the Middle East, Iran, and Central Asia, I'm going to zoom in, and we're going to focus entirely on the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, along with the first Anatolian beyliks, like the Artukids, the Saltukids, and the Danishmends, and so on. And that, I guess, is going to mark the beginning of Informal Season 5. I have been thinking of eventually doing bonus episodes of a sort that cover the rest of the history of the Great Seljuks and the successor states outside of Anatolia, but I haven't really decided yet. So if you are interested in that, please do let me know. Okay, so that's the plan. Let's just dive in. Now, before we really introduce Seljuk, we need to back up a bit and look at what was happening to the Oghuz Yabgu State. You might want to re-listen to episode 16 to get a feel for what the state was like. Remember, the Oghuz Yabgu State was not a great power on the steppes. It was a relatively disorganized, fractious coalition, and by the 10th century it was becoming increasingly squeezed by its more powerful neighbors, stuck between the decaying Khazar Khanate to its west, the new and mighty Karakhanid Khanate to its east, a powerful uncooked steppe confederation called the Kınık Kıpçak Union to its north, and the lands of the Caliphate to its south. The rise of the Karakhanids and the Kınık Kıpçak Union in the 10th century in particular put increasing pressure on the Oghuz. In the east, the Karakhanids conquered the steppes around the Sırdarya River as the mighty Kınık Kıpçak Union pushed down from the north. And remember, as we discussed last time, this was also the time following the collapse of the Uyghur Khanate far to the east. So just as with the turmoil that drove the Oghuz west in the first place, this was a time of violence and dislocation across the steppe. Additionally, modern historians posit that climate change may have made the northern steppes less viable for grazing herds, pushing tribes to the south. The picture we get from the sources is of upheaval and migration of tribes across the steppes east and north of the Aral Sea, as various tribes began displacing each other, moving steadily westwards and southwards. The history of Al-Marwazi provides a flavor of these movements on the steppe. The Kun were followed or pursued by the Kai, who, being more numerous and stronger than they, drove them out of their new pasture lands. They then moved into the territory of the Shari, and the Shari migrated into the lands of the Turkmen, who in their turn shifted into the eastern parts of the Guz territory. And all of this was happening as the mighty Karakhanid Khanate established itself north of the Samanid Emirate and drove the Oghuz Yabgu State out of the Sırdarya River plain. This pressure on the Oghuz from the east and the north meant that they were increasingly being pushed into a box, a tiny territory between the Caspian and Aral Seas. Likely, even the original Oghuz capital at Yenikent on the eastern fringe of the Aral Sea was lost to the Karakhanids around this time. And it appears that as the already fractious and relatively weak Oghuz Yabgu state came under this pressure in the late 10th century, steadily weakening, the Oghuz attempted to respond the same way as the other steppe tribes: push further west and south. As we discussed briefly in episode 16, beginning in the late 800s after initially allying to push the Pechenegs off the steppe, the relationship between the Oghuz and the Khazar Khanate became increasingly violent. This continued into the 10th century as the now ancient Khazar Khanate began to weaken. In 965, the Oghuz appear to have formed an alliance with the Kievan Rus, that is the Viking settlers on the rivers of Russia, to attack the Khazar Khanate to great success. A further joint assault in 985 finished off the Khazar Khanate. And I think that it's important to note that it was with the fall of the Khazar Khanate that the Ashina clan finally fell from power for good. The original Turkish royal family that could trace its origins all the way back to Bumin and the valley of Ergenekon is now out of the picture. But it would turn out that the final fall of the Ashina coincided with the rise of a new great Turkish dynasty, because it is here that Seljuk finally enters the story. We know almost nothing about Seljuk's early life. According to tradition, he was 107 years old when he died in 1008, putting his birth in the year 907. I think we should take that with a grain of salt, though, and just assume that he was probably born sometime in the early 10th century. He was born into the powerful Kınık tribe of the Oghuz Yabgu State, and would have come of age as a leader just as the confederation came under increasing pressure from the east. His father, Dukak, was a leader among the Kınık, and we can assume that Seljuk likewise came to be a high-ranking leader of the tribe. Though we can't be sure of the locations, he was likely born in what is now far western Kazakhstan, on the steppes between the Caspian and the Aral Seas, somewhere near the Volga River, which essentially formed the eastern border with the Khazar Khanate at this time. Though our sources are muddy, it appears very likely that he and others of the Oghuz initially fought on the side of the Khazars, essentially some of the Oghuz serving as military muscle for the Khanate. It's also very likely that he even converted to Judaism, as was very common among the Khazar elite. Remember that the Oghuz confederation was a very loose confederation, and I think that we should imagine that some tribes decided to side with the Khazars against their fellow Oghuz, preferring the fading Khan to the fading Yabgu. But it appears that by the 960s, as both the Oghuz Yabgu State and the Khazar Khanate weakened, and as more and more tribes began pressing in on the Oghuz from the east and the north, Seljuk decided to switch sides. He appears to have participated in both the 965 and 985 campaigns to finish off the Khazar Khanate. But with the Khazars now gone, the wall that had separated the Balkans, Ukraine, the Caucasus, even Byzantium from the roiling tumult of the steppe world of Central Asia disappeared. There was now no one who could stop the movement of the tribes to the west. Anyone who could cross the Volga could go as far west as they wanted, and tribes began flooding west, which necessitated invading into the steppes of the Oghuz along the way. As the dislocation in Seljuk's lands along the former Khazar borderlands grew, Seljuk decided that he had to move south. He and his clan had to flee the violence and disorder following the fall of the Khazars. Now, given that Seljuk's descendants are going to go on to found a truly massive empire, it's tempting to think that the flight of Seljuk must have involved a huge number of people, massive tribes on the move. But this really doesn't seem to be the case. The medieval Persian historian Mirkhwand relates that Seljuk thought much about how to save himself. He decided to flee into exile. When he had decided on flight with 100 horsemen, 1,500 camels, and 50,000 sheep, he headed for the lands of Samarkand. Seljuk thus likely fled south with a relatively small number of nomadic families, ultimately coming to a place called Jand. Jand was a region along the Sirdarya River, near to where the river flows into the Aral Sea in Khwarezm. Upon moving into these lands, Seljuk tried to ingratiate himself with the local rulers, the Muslim lords of Khwarezm, who were theoretically subjects of the Samanids, though remember from the last episode that Samanid authority was very weak by this point, as the state had largely fallen under the control of various Turkish slave commanders and local governors. Seljuk likely converted to Islam as an old man for this reason around this time, in the late 980s or early 990s. He and his people had come to this land essentially as refugees, and they did not want to antagonize the local elites. Converting to Islam was part of showing them that they were not a threat. According to some sources, Seljuk may have even agreed to fight for the local lords if required to, which would have gone some way to making them more at ease with these steppe Turks showing up to graze their herds in the local pasturage. As Seljuk and his people settled along the river in the lands of Jand, the Oghuz Yabgu State basically began to melt down. The combination of invasions from the north and the east and the collapse of the Khazar wall stopping flight to the west resulted in the total breakdown of the state. The Oghuz tribes started migrating away from the old homeland, and the union disintegrated. Some tribes went west into the lands of the former Khazar Khanate, while others went south like Seljuk and his people, entering into the Muslim world. And Seljuk slowly started to begin to emerge as the leader of these Oghuz refugees fleeing south. In the late 900s, the penultimate Oghuz Yabgu seems to have tried to get Seljuk to pay tribute to him, but Seljuk reportedly refused, saying that Muslims don't pay taxes to infidels. Though to be clear, Seljuk had absolutely no real religious objection here. I honestly think it's doubtful he even knew very much about the tenets of Islam at all. He simply knew that there was no way for the Yabgu to force him to do anything anymore. The Oghuz Yabgu State was clearly in its death throes. Indeed, as we will discuss in a later episode, by the early 11th century at the latest, it's pretty clear that the institution of the Yabgu disappeared. The state would be destroyed, but as we will see, the Oghuz tribes themselves would endure. Thousands began flooding south to seek a new life in the rich lands of Islam. And it was likely around this time, as thousands of Turkish tribes fled south, that Seljuk was able to really expand the number of tribes and families subject to him. As more and more Oghuz fled the disorder of the steppe world, they gravitated to this established family. In essence, they began to form a new tribe or tribal confederation based around Seljuk and his descendants. They really became the Seljuks. And while they're often called the Seljukids, because in English we typically say the Seljuks, that's what I'm going to go with on this podcast. In the last years of his life, Seljuk began to get more drawn into the politics of the Islamic world his new clan now bordered. As we discussed last time, these years, the end of the 10th century and the beginning of the 11th, were a time of chaos in the lands of the dying Samanid Emirate. Indeed, Seljuk fought for the Samanids and the Simjurids against the Karakhanids, as the Karakhanids began to invade the tottering emirate to briefly conquer Bukhara in 992. It was in recognition of this that Seljuk and his people were granted summer pastures near Samarkand and winter pastures near Bukhara. But then the Karakhanids came back with a vengeance, finally finishing off the Samanids and conquering Bukhara in 999, following which Jand was no doubt yet again a safer place for Seljuk and his people. Seljuk died in 1009 in the new lands to which he had led his people. According to tradition, he was 107 years old. When he died, his people were a relatively small nomadic confederation of Oghuz Turks, probably numbering no more than perhaps tens of thousands of families and living on the frontiers of the Muslim world. There is no way at all that Seljuk could have possibly known the remarkable future that awaited them. Seljuk was succeeded by his eldest son, Arslan Israel, whose name means the Lion of Israel. When Arslan succeeded his father, his people faced a chaotic and uncertain world. The Karakhanids had finished off the Samanid Emirate and now ruled all of the lands north of the Amudarya, the great Silk Road cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, Tashkent, and Fergana. South of the Great River, the great and powerful state created by the former Turkish slave soldiers of the Samanids, the Ghanzavid Ghulam State, routinely invaded deep into India, carrying great wealth back into what is now Afghanistan. These two great neighboring Turkish states had a complicated relationship, often locked into bitter conflict and war, but also going through periods of relative peace. But there were also great opportunities for the Seljuks here. These two great cooked Turkish states were locked in conflict with each other and were placed under increasing pressure from the uncooked Turkish nomads from the north, like the Seljuks. These people were fleeing south to escape the chaos of the steppe world as well as the effects of climate change, making the steppe more arid. For example, according to Ibn al-Athir, in 1018, the Karakhanids were forced to beat back an army of over 300,000 pagan Turks. This both weakened these states, making them vulnerable to attack, and made them hungry for allies, for the muscle provided by the steppe riders. and as the chaos on the northern steppes grew, more and more Oghuz fled south and joined Arslan Israel, swelling the numbers of the Seljuk forces and slowly transforming the Seljuks from a minor confederation into perhaps a middling confederation. And maybe Arslan Israel and the Seljuks would be able to further capitalize on these opportunities to expand their power and their influence and move even further into the rich lands of the south. And so Arslan Israel quickly became enmeshed in the internal politics of the Karakhanid Khanate. After the Karakhanids had finished off the Samnite Emirate and conquered Bukhara for good in 999, the lands of Khwarezm where the Seljuks lived had fallen under their hegemony. But in these chaotic times, of course, there was internal conflict, especially in a state like the Karakhanid Khanate, which, as we discussed last time, was divided into both east-west and then further divided within east and west in accordance with the traditional left-right division of Turkish Khanates. Arslan Israel fell in with a Karakhanid prince named Ali Tegin, who in 1020 attempted to conquer Bukhara for himself to set himself up as Khan in the west. In need of military muscle, he turned to the Seljuks, and with the aid of the Seljuks, Ali Tegin was able to conquer Bukhara and install himself as Khan. But he was naturally opposed in this by his brother and rival Ilek Khan, who in desperation turned to the greatest Ghaznavid Sultan of all time, the famous Mahmud of Ghazna, who we briefly introduced last time. Mahmud of Ghazna was really one of the greatest conquerors in world history. His name is still spoken with great bitterness and rage by Hindu nationalists today. He was the son of Sebük Tegin, the Turkish slave soldier who had been purchased by the founder of the Ghaznavid state, the slave general Alp Tegin, and who was married to Alp Tegin's daughter and succeeded to the throne. After Sebük Tegin's death, Mahmud succeeded his father, and while Sebük Tegin had initiated the first Ghaznavid raids of India, it was under Mahmud that the Ghaznavid war machine was really built. A war machine designed to devastate India and cart its immense wealth back off to Ghazna. Every year, the Ghaznavid armies would storm down from the Hindu Kush mountains to ravage northern India. Under Mahmud's reign, the Ghanzavid Ghulam State, the slave empire, became the regional superpower and really the top military power anywhere in the world at this time. In a lifetime of incredible and storied campaigns that unfortunately I just don't have the time to get into, Mahmud won stunning victories, annexed Punjab, and set up local Hindu and Muslim vassals to rule the lands of northern India. But at the same time, like his father, he never forgot the origins of the House of Ghazna, the slave kings born out of the dead Samnite Emirate, and he always kept one eye on the lands of Transoxiana, Khorasan, and Balkh, from where his dynasty had arisen and where they still ruled. So upon hearing from Ilek Khan that he needed help urgently, Mahmud of Ghazna promptly assembled a massive army and marched across the Amu Darya in 1029 to remove Ali Tegin. He could then install Ilek Khan and get a pliant ally on the western throne of the House of Afrasiab. And thus began the great conflict between the mighty House of Ghazna and the upstart Seljuks, now merely minor vassals of the Karakhanids who supported Ali Tegin. So as Mahmud crossed the river, the Seljuks mustered to support Ali Tegin. The all-powerful Ghaznavid army came upon the Seljuks and camped in the steppes and deserts near Bukhara. The history of Ibn al-Athir says that Mahmud saw the strength of the Seljuks and the force and large numbers they possessed. Now, this is really the first real reference in the Islamic history to the Seljuks as a people, not just as a name for the dynasty, but for the various Oghuz Turkish tribes that had formed a confederation around the dynasty. But as Ibn al-Athir was writing during the later Seljuk period under Seljuk patronage, it's very likely that he was overstating the power and might of the Seljuks at this time. Regardless, even if they did possess large numbers, the Seljuks and Arslan Israel were really just no match for the great Mahmud of Ghazna. The Karakhanid prince Ali Tegin saw that there was no way to oppose this massive army, and so he fled. With his prince gone, and facing the might of the Ghaznavids, Arslan Israel saw that there was no way to resist, so he made the hard choice of presenting himself before Mahmud and putting himself at the great Sultan's mercy. Mahmud decided to arrest him and send him off to India as prisoner. Ibn al-Athir relates, he, that is Mahmud, made a night attack on Arslan's tents and slew many of his followers, but a large number of them survived and fled from him coming to Khorasan, where they caused disturbances and indulged in pillage. Mahmud sent against them an army, which took them captive or expelled them from Khorasan. Mahmud no doubt thought that by doing this, he would basically cause the Seljuk confederation to dissolve. And he had a good reason for thinking that. Steppe confederations are notoriously fickle, especially when tied around one dynasty, and even more so when the charismatic founder is gone. Indeed, the most likely outcome is that this would have ended the Seljuks, and the dynasty would be a mere footnote in Islamic histories, known only by historians who specialized in medieval Central Asian history. And in fact, that's sort of how things looked in the immediate aftermath of this defeat in 1029. Many of the Seljuk tribes dispersed throughout Khorasan, becoming subjects of the Ghaznavids, and even came to be recruited into the Ghaznavid armies to guard Central Asia while the Ghaznavid war machine plundered India. According to one source, Mahmud of Ghazna even said to the imprisoned Arslan Israel, "As you can see, most of the time we make Gaza in India, and Khorasan is left defenseless and empty of soldiers. If an enemy appears and our regent requests of you, you will send what cavalry forces you can." Additionally, Ibn al-Athir reports that the tribesmen of 2,000 tents departed and went off to Isfahan. These 2,000 families would go to western Iran and then move up into Azerbaijan and even into eastern Anatolia, the very first Turkish settlers in what would eventually become the homeland of the Turks. Ibn al-Athir actually provides a very long and detailed account of the adventures of these 2,000, which includes writing deep into Iraq and even to what is now Diyarbakir in Turkey. But given as they don't go on to found the Seljuk Empire, they're sort of out of our main story, at least for now. Other Seljuks were exiled to Mount Balkhan, which lies on the very western edge of modern-day Turkmenistan, near the Caspian Sea. According to Ibn al-Athir, they plundered and wreaked havoc and murder, and had to be disciplined by the Ghaznavids several times. So it sort of seemed likely that the story of the Seljuks would kind of end there. A large portion of the tribes now dispersed on both sides of the river, but in service of the Ghaznavids and the now pliant western Karakhanids, with a very small remnant escaping out further to the west. But then two things happened that upended the story, that made the Seljuks not a footnote in a history book, but the subjects of multiple histories. Firstly, in 1030, 1 year after defeating the Seljuks, Mahmud of Ghazna died unexpectedly at the age of 59. He was succeeded by his son Masud, who of course had to secure himself on the throne. Masud turned to the Seljuks in Khorasan for support in the civil war that inevitably followed the death of Mahmud, and other claimants would likewise need the Seljuks for muscle. Secondly, the removal and imprisonment of Arslan Israel in India actually opened up a power vacuum in the leadership of the Seljuks, and it was in this vacuum that two extremely talented leaders would emerge, two leaders who would save the Seljuks from the dustbin of history. Remember, as we have said over and over again on this podcast, the Turks would never develop clear rules of succession. Any member of the ruling family had a claim, and naturally, a series of claimants now emerged. One claimant was Kutalmush, the son of Arslan Israel, who hoped to take his father's place. Another claimant was a son of Seljuk, a man named Musa Yabgu, and Musa Yabgu was joined and supported by two of his nephews, two brothers who were the sons of yet another one of Seljuk's sons. And it would be these two brothers, Tughrul and Chaghri, who would be destined to lead the Seljuks to greatness. Now, because Tughrul and Chaghri are eventually going to win this initial Seljuk fight to be the leaders, it's a bit hard to figure out how the power struggle worked in the early days. As they say, the winners write the histories, so what we have in the sources always plays them up. And it plays up Tughrul in particular because he's the one who's eventually going to come out on top as the paramount leader in the end. Additionally, Kutalmush's descendants are going to end up ruling in Anatolia as the Seljuk Sultans of Rum, and so the histories from their side always try to glide over what happens here. The sources are just very unclear and full of discrepancies and contradictions that just can't be resolved. Basically, we just don't know. But it seems likely that Musa Yabgu, as the eldest, started out as the paramount ruler, and was then joined at the top by the brothers Tughrul and Chaghri. By the early 1030s, these three sort of formed a ruling triumvirate, while Kutalmush came to be subordinated, though he would bide his time and wait for his opportunity to claim his birthright. Tughrul and Chaghri were both sons of one of Seljuk's sons, a man named Mikhail. Incidentally, it's the fact that Mikhail and Arslan Israel were given Jewish names that is one of the biggest indications that Seljuk had previously converted to Judaism. Chaghri was the elder, born in about 989, with Tughrul arriving a couple years later in 993. Their father Mikhail then died in the early 900s, and the brothers were raised in the household of their elderly grandfather Seljuk. We know very little about their personalities or their early lives, but they were raised in the traditional steppe lifestyle and felt tense with the herds, and they were illiterate, neither spoke Persian or Arabic. But while Musa Yabgu, Tughrul, and Chaghri had consolidated their leadership of the Seljuks over the Oghuz tribes by the early 1030s, they themselves remained vassals of the Karakhanid prince Ali Tegin. And Ali Tegin saw that with Mahmud of Ghazna now dead, he again had a chance to conquer the western half of the Karakhanid Khanate. So he drove Ilek Khan out of Bukhara and reclaimed the title of Western Khan. At the same time, in Khorasan to the south of the river, Mahmud of Ghazna's son Masud quickly won his internal civil war and was now looking to completely conquer the western half of the Karakhanid Khanate. So he reached out to the eastern Khan of the Karakhanids who sat in Kashgar and struck a deal to conquer Bukhara and get rid of Ali Tegin. He placed a great army under the command of the great Turkish slave general and governor named Altyn Tash and sent it north to defeat Ali Tegin. So yet again, war broke out between the Karakhanids and the Ghaznavids, this time with Seljuk troops on both sides. Ali Tegin was able to get Musa, Tughrul, and Chaghri to join him, while Altyn Tash had those Seljuks who had joined with Masud under his control. The two armies met at Dabusia, a fortress near Samarkand. Now, we last encountered the fortress of Dabusia nearly 400 years ago in episode 12, when the Umayyad forces had fled there after Suluk Khan had driven them out of Kumarja. Now, in the year 1032, it became the place of a brutal and bloody stalemate between the Karakhanids and the Ghaznavids. In this horrible and bloody siege, both sides were terribly weakened. The Ghaznavid commander Altyn Tash himself was killed, and there was great loss of life on both sides. But though Altyn Tash died here, his son Harun will still have a role to play in our story. Masud was forced to realize that he could not defeat the Karakhanids, and he had to return back across the Amudarya. But the campaign had been brutal and resulted in both sides becoming horribly weakened. As a result, Masud's power began to slip, and he decided that it would be too dangerous to appoint Altyn Tash's son Harun to succeed his late father. Indignantly, Harun raised the flag of revolt and began looking for allies. And just as Harun was looking for muscle to oppose the weakening Masud and the House of Ghazna, the Seljuks showed up on his doorstep. After the Battle of Dabusia, it appears that Ali Tegin basically turned on the Seljuks. Our sources are a bit muddled and conflicting, and I've read both that Ali Tegin himself or the last Oghuz Yabgu Shah Melik attacked the Seljuks in the aftermath of Dabusia. I kind of think maybe it was both of them together, with Shah Melik carrying out the operation himself on Ali Tegin's orders. According to tradition, the last Oghuz Yabgu launched a surprise attack against the Seljuks in 1034 on Kurban Bayramı, that is the Feast of the Sacrifice, one of the holiest days in the Muslim calendar, and he killed 7,000 to 8,000 people, including men, women, and children while they were celebrating. The Seljuks were now in desperate straits, and so led by Musa, Tughrul, and Chaghri, in late 1034 the Seljuks fled from Transoxiana south across the great Amudarya River. According to Ibn al-Athir, their possessions and their children were taken, many of their women and offspring were imprisoned, and necessity made them cross to Khorasan. They fled into the waiting arms of Harun, who was eager to use these powerful steppe warriors to conquer Khorasan from Masud. At first they seem to have fled to Khwarezm, the delta where the river Sirdarya flows into the inland Aral Sea. There, with Harun, they prepared for an invasion of Khorasan. But then Ghaznavid agents managed to slip into Khorasan and assassinate Harun in early 1035. Now, without their patron, Musa, Tughrul, and Chaghri decided that they could not stay in Khwarezm. Harun was dead, the Ghaznavids were coming, and Khwarezm was just way too close to Ali Tegin and the last Oghuz Yabgu, Shah Melik. So yet again they fled south, crossing the great Karakum Desert, one of the driest places in the world, and came into Khorasan itself. According to tradition, upon hearing of the arrival of the Seljuks, the Ghaznavid governor of Khorasan exclaimed, "Khorasan is lost." But this is certainly a later invention, written later by someone who knew how the story was going to turn out, and likely for a Seljuk prince eager to hear about how his ancestors swept into Khorasan as great conquerors. In fact, the Seljuks were at this time basically a motley crew of refugees. Indeed, it seems like their main preoccupation was finding pasturage, land to graze their herds. There's even a letter preserved in the roughly contemporaneous history of Baihaqi, supposedly written by Musa, Tughrul and Chaghri to Masud, in which they requested pasturage in exchange for fighting off other Turkish nomads, and saying in part, "If the Sultan sees fit, he will accept us as his servants, so that one of us will pay homage to him at his exalted court, and the others will undertake whatever service the Sultan commands, and we will rest in his great shadow. If, God forbid, the Sultan does not agree, we will not know what will happen, for we have nowhere else to go." And that seems like a far more accurate representation of the arrival of the Seljuks in Khorasan. Nevertheless, from a Ghaznavid perspective, the arrival of the Seljuks was still worrying. Even as refugees, Turkish steppe warriors could be incredibly dangerous. One Ghaznavid commander reportedly wrote to Masud, "Up to this point, this has been a mere affair of shepherds. Now they have become emirs who seize provinces." Masud no doubt remembered the Oghuz who had fled his father Mahmud to the west and who had gone on to rampage throughout Iran, Iraq, and Azerbaijan. Additionally, there's evidence in the sources and in the archaeological record for climatic disruption and a series of bad harvests. The same climatic changes that were pushing the nomads from the steppes had caused famine in the settled lands. In such circumstances, massive herds showing up to graze could turn out to be intolerable for the settled peasantry. And so Masud decided to drive the Seljuks off instead of granting them land and titles in his domains. In 1035, Masud assembled an army reportedly 17,000 strong and began marching it west personally. The Seljuks, when they had first entered Khorasan, had come up to the capital of Merv, but had since decamped to the west, to the plains of Nessa, near what is now Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan. There, as the Ghaznavid army marched along the plains of Nessa, with the great Köpet Dağ mountains to their left, on June 29, 1035, they entered into a small valley and suddenly looked up to see the Seljuks surrounding them on all sides. The Seljuks had ambushed the unsuspecting Ghaznavid army, and now they charged down upon them, inflicting a humiliating defeat on Sultan Masud. Masud was now forced to agree to the Seljuk demands. The Seljuks would be permitted to stay in Khorasan, near the Köpet Dağ mountain range. In exchange for military service, they were given pasturage near the cities, and the Seljuk lords were granted lordship over the cities of the region. Musa Yabgu was given overlordship of the town of Ferave, Chaghri was given the desert city of Dihistan, and Tughrul was given Nessa itself. And it would be from this string of small settlements on the fringe of the great Karakum desert that the mighty Seljuk Empire would be born. Now at first, this arrangement seems to have worked out well enough for both sides. Indeed, Masud even took the Seljuks up on their promise of military aid in exchange for the land grants and titles. The Seljuks fought off other Turkish steppe nomads attempting to raid into Khorasan, though this was just as much in their interest as in the interest of the Ghaznavids, and in any event, it seems likely that they also invited their cousins, the other Oghuz tribes, to come and join them in these new lands, rebuilding and again swelling the ranks of the Seljuks. But this modus vivendi did not last, of course. Within a year, the Seljuks were pushing for more. Likely they saw how weak the Ghaznavids really were in Khorasan, and they realized how strong they were actually becoming as more and more Oghuz tribes flocked to join them. In 1036, Musa, Tughrul and Chaghri sent off a letter to Masud demanding that the Seljuks be given 3 towns, including Merv, the capital of Khorasan itself. Now, what the Seljuks envisioned here was actually something very familiar in the Islamic world ever since the anarchy at Samarra. If you'll recall, at the beginning of the anarchy, the actual administration of a place might be left in place, while a Turkish emir would be given an iktah, the right to collect taxes from that place. It's just that these were Turkish steppe nomads, not Turkish slave soldiers now demanding this right. But the important thing is that the Seljuks at this point weren't really interested in actually governing these territories. They didn't actually want to run the cities. They were totally fine leaving that to the existing Persian bureaucrats who owed their loyalty to the Ghaznavid Sultan and then up the chain theoretically to the Caliph. The Seljuks wanted tax farming rights, they wanted access to the pasturage to graze their herds, they wanted the right to roam around the countryside as they saw fit, and that was basically it. Now, as we'll discuss in later episodes, that's going to change, of course, but it would take a while. Sultan Masud, sitting in Ghazna, was not happy about this demand from the Seljuks. He was getting increasingly worried about these steppe nomads from the north, who had already bested him in the field once, and whose numbers were now swelling. And the Seljuks hadn't even waited for his response to their demands for the 3 great cities of Khorasan. Just after he had received their demand, he also received reports that the Seljuks were launching raids across Khorasan and Balkh. Chaghri himself led an army deep into Balkh, and Masud was worried that perhaps even Ghazna could be threatened. And so Masud decided that he had to deal with these Seljuk upstarts. He assembled an army, about 15,000 strong, and ordered it to march west again, this time determined not to get caught in an ambush. He himself marched off to India as the Ghaznavids were wont to do. This Ghaznavid army marched into Balkh, and it appears that it managed to scare Chaghri back to the new Seljuk homeland near the Köpet Dağ mountains in early 1037. But that was about it. Seljuk raids continued throughout 1037 and early 1038, and the Seljuks began to take actual cities while Masud was off in India. Indeed, it seems that all of Khorasan had fallen to the Seljuks by late 1038. We know frustratingly little about the campaigns that resulted in the Seljuk conquest of Khorasan in a little over a year. In essence, it appears that Ghaznavid authority basically collapsed, and the Seljuks kind of just walked in and asserted their will everywhere. The fall of Merv, the capital of Khorasan, isn't even attested to in the sources, though it must have happened at some point in 1037 or 1038. It appears that Nishapur, the great city of the northeastern Iranian plateau, on the far side of the Köpet Dağ mountains, probably fell in 1037 because archaeologists have discovered a coin with Seljuk inscriptions minted in Nishapur in 1037. And the very fact that the Seljuks actually minted coins shows just how quickly they were beginning to think of ruling, as opposed to merely taking tax revenue and pasturage. However, the numismatic evidence conflicts with the written sources, which all say that Nishapur fell in 1038. Ibn al-Athir, for example, writes of the fall of Nishapur and the conquest of all of Khorasan. During this year, Tughrul entered the city of Nishapur as ruler. This came about because the Seljukid Oghuz, when they appeared in Khorasan, caused trouble, plundered and ruined the land, and took captives, as we have related. That's basically it. Other sources are similarly annoyingly vague. But that said, we do have some indications as to why the Ghaznavids seem to have been completely unable to resist the rapid Seljuk conquest of Khorasan, why their power, in essence, evaporated. Firstly, though the Ghaznavid war machine was formidable, indeed really the greatest army in the world at this time, it was really geared towards raiding India. That was what it was built to do. It was heavy on war elephants, which are a big deal on the Indian subcontinent, and large armored infantry and heavy cavalry divisions, which were of course supplemented by the classic Turkish steppe nomad warriors. Don't forget that the Ghaznavids themselves were originally Turkish slave soldiers. But this type of army faced difficulties operating in the mountains and deserts and steppes of Central Asia, particularly as the ongoing famine made it hard to find provisions. Logistics were difficult in this terrain, and the Ghaznavid armies could only move very slowly. Now, when the Ghaznavids actually could get their whole army together and engage the Seljuks without being ambushed, they had the upper hand. But in that case, the Seljuks would simply do the classic steppe thing. They would just sort of run away and melt back into the steppe. The Seljuks, on the other hand, were mobile steppe nomad warriors. They could move quickly, they could strike and then disappear. They also didn't require massive supply chains and logistical feats to stay in the field. They lived off of the herds. As Ibn al-Athir writes, the Ghaznavids struggled to find supplies, but the Seljuks did not care about that, for they are content with little. And anyway, in 1037 and 1038, Masud and the better part of his Ghaznavid armies were off campaigning in India, as they did basically every year. And so without a large Ghaznavid army capable of breaking them in the field, the Seljuks simply rode up to the cities and towns in Khorasan and demanded submission, and the urban nobility, the Persian elites who ran these cities, had to figure out what to do. And here I think we see another one of the long-term effects of the anarchy at Samarra. The nobility, the bureaucrats, were so used to dealing with Turkish warlords by this point that they saw the Seljuks as just another Turkish band. The tradition of Turkish military might, paired with a continuing Persian and Arabic administrative state, was long-standing by this point. And indeed, the personal unpopularity of Masud, his high taxation and sort of general incompetence, his inability to actually live up to his great father, made many of these Persian nobles and bureaucrats say, yeah, whatever. The Seljuks seem fine. Indeed, many seem to have welcomed a change from the rule of the Ghaznavids. In fact, the real resistance to Seljuk rule in the cities of the region, at least initially, seems to have been driven not by the nobility, but by the common people, and occasionally popular rebellions would have to be put down. Thus, by 1038, the Seljuks were basically in control of all of Khorasan. Finally waking up to the danger, Masud realized that he had to do something about this. So instead of raiding India, over the winter of 1038, Masud began assembling a large Ghaznavid army to go and crush the Seljuks and restore Ghaznavid authority over Khorasan when spring came. The Ghaznavid Turkish cavalry was summoned to Ghazna. The masses of infantry were armored and provisioned. Even the great and famous war elephants from India were brought north through the passes to Balkh. And so, according to our sources, a Ghaznavid army 100,000 strong took the field in spring 1039 as the snow melted. The mighty Ghaznavid army marched through the mountains and into Khorasan to confront the Seljuks. But as we discussed earlier, though the Ghaznavid force was superior to the Seljuk steppe army, it was hampered by logistical difficulties and the fact that the Seljuks were fine with sort of just running away if they felt they couldn't win. While the Seljuks valued holding the cities, their armies lived off the herds. They didn't have supply lines. They didn't depend on holding cities to fight. And the Ghaznavid army, which again was basically designed to invade India, was built to terrify armies and capture cities, which is what they proceeded to do in Khorasan and did quite well for that matter. It's just that retaking the cities of the region was not what was called for. What was called for was riding out and defeating the nomads on the field and driving them out of the region. But the Ghaznavid army just wasn't really built to do that. So this meant that any victory that the Ghaznavids had was basically always going to be temporary, which must have been incredibly frustrating for the Ghaznavid commanders. Even though they could and did succeed on their terms, the steppe nomads were fighting a war on different terms. In April 1039, the Ghaznavid army inflicted a pretty crushing defeat on Chaghri and his army, but then Chaghri simply fled the battlefield with most of his troops. The Ghaznavid army followed this up by retaking Serach and even the great city of Herat, basically without a fight. But then what? The Seljuks were still out there in the countryside, and they would just swoop back in the second the army left. On May 26, 1039, Masud again brought the Oghuz to battle, but again it did him no good. As Ibn al-Athir relates, he, Masud, brought them to battle in which he was victorious. They withdrew far from him, but then approached again in the vicinity of Merv. He met them in another battle, in which about 1,500 of them were killed. The rest fled and entered into the desert where they could be safe. Nishapur was likewise retaken without a fight in late 1039, which also was of practically no use at all. Ibn al-Athir writes, Masud was greatly downcast, and leaving Herat went to Nishapur and from there to Serach. Whenever he pursued the Seljuks to one place, they abandoned it for another. Things went on like this until winter overtook Masud's men, and they took up quarters in Nishapur to wait for spring. Totally fed up with these infuriating steppe nomads, Masud and the Ghaznavid commanders sitting in Nishapur over the winter of 1039 knew that they just had to bring the Seljuks to battle in the field. If they could find a way to engage them head on, then the vastly superior Ghaznavid army could finish them off. So as the snow thawed in early 1040, while Masud stayed in Nishapur, the Ghaznavid army moved on to capture Nessa, the very first city that Tughrul and the Seljuks had acquired a decade earlier. And yet again, it did them basically no good at all. The Seljuk forces simply withdrew into the steppe where the Ghaznavids couldn't get to them. Returning to Nishapur, the army was in very bad spirits. Reportedly, Masud had spent the winter and spring fully engaged in his pleasures and his drinking, which of course rankled the soldiers who had been forced to march around Central Asia chasing these annoying steppe nomads instead of ransacking the rich lands of India. As summer approached, the commanders and viziers pressured Masud to lead the army out to bring the Seljuks to battle. They just had to find a way to force these infuriating people to fight. And so, on May 16th, 1040, Masud and his army marched out of Nishapur towards Merv, determined to bring the Seljuks to battle. Upon hearing that the Ghaznavid army was on the march, the Seljuk forces led by Chaghri began shadowing the plotting Ghaznavid army, lumbering through the mountain passes with its war elephants and heavy armored infantry columns. The Ghaznavid army was at this point low on morale, as the men had spent years trekking through the deserts and mountains of Khorasan chasing after steppe nomads who kept disappearing into the wilderness, and Masud was becoming increasingly unpopular with his troops due to his habit of getting drunk in a palace while they were on the march. On May 23, 1040, as the Ghaznavid army entered into the desert near Merv, they were forced to camp at a place with very little water, a place near a small village named Dandan Khan. Ibn al-Athir says, the heat was intense, and there was not sufficient water for the Sultan and his immediate staff. With the shortage of water, Masud ordered that priority be given to his personal bodyguard and to himself. I mean, you gotta look after number one, of course. This, of course, enraged the already fed-up common soldiers, and a brawl broke out between some of the soldiers and the Sultan's bodyguard, which quickly escalated. But then, the Ghaznavid troops, preoccupied with fighting each other, heard the rumbling of hooves, the twanging of bows, and the shriek of Turkish war cries. They looked up to see a massive Seljuk charge bearing down on them. Because shadowing the Ghaznavid army, Chaghri had seen the discord in the ranks of the Ghaznavid troops and knew that this was his chance. He quickly pulled together all the men he could get his hands on and ordered a massive Seljuk charge. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Seljuk forces crashed into the disorganized and divided Ghaznavid army, utterly breaking it. The great war elephants, the armored men feared throughout India, even the Turkish cavalry of the Ghaznavids were of no use. The defeat was total. The disorganized army broke and was routed. Masud barely escaped with his life. He fled south and east as quickly as he could, in shock that his great army could have been destroyed by a force a fraction of its size. He made it to the capital of Ghazna, but even there he feared the Seljuks. There was now no army in Central Asia to resist them. In desperation, he fled to India, hoping to raise a new army to retake Balkh. Instead, the Ghaznavid army in India overthrew him and placed his brother Muhammad on the throne. Masud was imprisoned in Giri in modern-day Pakistan before being executed. For their part, the Seljuks were stunned at their victory. Reportedly, Chaghri's men did not dismount for 3 days and would not be parted from their horses except when they needed to eat and drink and so on, out of fear for the return of Masud's army. Eventually, the scale of their victory finally dawned on them, and they realized what they had accomplished. Ghaznavid rule in Khorasan was finished. Not only was Seljuk rule of Khorasan now confirmed, but all of Balkh, all of the Ghaznavid domains in Central Asia were theirs for the taking. They would not be just steppe lords of Khorasan, serving some sultan in Ghazna or some khan in Bukhara. They would be the sultans in their own right. And so next time, we will discuss how, in the aftermath of the Battle of Dandan Khan, their new state, the Great Seljuk Empire, came to be born.